I hope you enjoyed that little video about the Asia Center. Just to note that as we proceed to the formal start in a few minutes, there will be a quick poll being circulated. Do you think COVID-19 is a regressed democracy? So you please provide us with your input on that. I take this opportunity to note the upcoming Asia Center events on COVID-19 and vaccine nationalism, which will take place in January, on January 20th, a timely topic as the vaccines are rolling out. Starting today, the first person to be vaccinated, to receive the vaccine, got it yesterday, a 90-year-old person in the UK. And then we will have our conference in next year, COVID-19 in Asia, Communication, Nationalism, Technology, from 6 to 8 October 2021. And of course, we welcome partnerships for this conference next year. So please send us expressions of interest, as you please. Let me turn to Yuki and any announcements.
Oh, so now I think it's about to share the polls result. Okay, so now from the questions of the poll, do you think COVID-19 pandemic has regressed democracies? So 64% said yes and 36% says no. So now I would like to have the webinar guidelines. Please, due to the Zoom webinar version, participants are placed on mute and videos also permanently disabled for the internet stabilities. And throughout the online report runs, if participants have questions, please send through the chat box or Q&A sessions. We will gather all the questions and then have a discussion at the end. And also please look out for the chat box. We will have an update message throughout the sessions. And at the end, please keep an eye on the chat box as well. We will send the survey in. And also we would like to invite you to our social media action. Please go like and check in at Asia Center Facebook page. Please share the Facebook live stream and subscribe to our Asia Center YouTube channels and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Now I'll hand over to Robin.
Thank you very much, Yuki. So as we kickstart the formal part of this webinar for this report launch, let me first welcome you all. And also let me first start by recognizing my colleagues who have contributed both to this event and to the report. To my left is Claude Fletcher, who contributed substantially in terms of research and managing this event, as well as Yuki Puchakanit, who, well, she is a communications intern and is managing all of our communication efforts today. You may not see them, but of course, there are other colleagues in the room. Yawi, who is taking care of the technical side, Alicia, who is also taking care of communications and so on, and Klang, to my right, helping us with various things, also an intern. So thank you all for being here. I think this is a timely webinar, timely topic. And I begin by noting that tomorrow is Human Rights Day, 10th of December. And so it is interesting that the United Nations has called upon the world, called upon us, called upon civil society and others to place human rights at the center of all our COVID responses and strategies. And in particular, to place human rights at the center of our responses to redressing the regression in rights that may have taken place, and in fact has taken place substantially around the world. So it is a timely topic, and we are grateful for the speakers and panelists who are here today. You see before you the program for today. I will ask Dr. James Gomez to present the report in a few minutes. This will then be followed by a discussion starting with Dr. Rebecca Stratting from La Trobe University, followed by Kristina Kironska now I hope I get the name right, Palatsky University in Olomouc in the Czech Republic. Thereafter, we will have Celito Arlegui, who is the Executive Director of the Council of Asian Liberals and Democrats. And finally, and certainly not the least, we have Patricia Galdamez, who is Senior Advisor of the Permanent Secretariat of the Community of Democracies. This will be followed by a Q&A, which will be moderated by yours truly, and we will end with some closing remarks. So let's proceed now. Let me invite Dr. James Gomez to present the report to you all.
Yeah, thank you very much. This report has been quite a few months in the making. The report was unique in the sense that it is one of the few reports that took a longitudinal approach to examining the impact of COVID-19 on democracy in Southeast Asia. I will now go through the contents page of the report. The contents page of the report covers some of the key areas. Apart from the introduction and background that sets the context of the report also examines very clearly the laws and policies introduced this year in response to COVID-19. These are especially emergency and temporary laws. We will see how these laws and policies, impact protests around the region and how they curb it. How these laws and actions erode electoral democracy, how they stifle political criticism, how these laws and actions, have been used to mount an attack on the media, how in the net impact, surveillance has increased throughout in the region, and I will argue from the evidence in the report, will leave us all post-COVID a very strong authoritarian residue. And finally, the funding shifts that have taken place and to some extent have also hampered civil society as donors fumbled with how they could respond and grapple with their own rigid guidelines in this very long drawn out pandemic. And then I'll take through some of the key recommendations which will center largely on strengthening civil society. So for those of you who will look at the report, there are a few things to note that can form the key takeaways of the report. Firstly, COVID-19 is an accelerator, and unfortunately in this regard, it's an accelerator of a regression in democracy in the region. Women and youth have become the new targets of authoritarian governments. The COVID-19 pandemic has also given governments an opportunity to design and implement national level lockdowns for an extended period of time, which they have not had the opportunity to do so this lifetime. And as I mentioned earlier, there will be one key authoritarian residue that has built up compared to other crises that the region has faced. This is a protracted one, and surveillance is going to be the key residue. And finally, to us, it's clear that civil society is the one that can be depended upon to be the defender of human rights. So just a little insight into how the report was assembled. We looked at all the COVID-19 laws and policies that have been passed and introduced and renewed from January to the end of November. We want to use this opportunity, the report and activities after the report, to communicate, what are the challenges facing civil society and what are the opportunities that, civil society can take advantage of. And to signal that we need to be fluent about what crises do to democracy and human rights, and we need to be prepared. So the one thing that is clear to us in this report, that many civil society as well as the donors were not prepared. And last, a little bit on the methodology. We looked at over 200 reports. These were government reports, as well as UN documents, INGO reports and case studies. We looked at media articles. We had several online consultations, and also we submitted the report to several people to review. And we've taken all those feedback in putting the report together. So with this, I'm able to go next to the background and set the context of this report. Because this is a crisis and we are studying a crisis, for us, framing it around crisis was important. The region has, experienced several key crises. And after each crisis, an authoritarian residue was left behind. And moving forward, after every crisis, this residue, it built up and enlarged and became elaborate. So if I can bring you back to the 1997 Asian financial crisis, this is where the region first, in an effort to boost recovery, relaxed labor laws. And that's why, in the region, we have this whole range of work around migrant workers' rights and undocumented workers' rights. Because what was supposed to be a temporary boost for economic recovery became permanent and long, and that, relaxation of rights around labor affected both those who were coming from abroad and also those at home. Then, within a few years, we experienced the September 11 attacks. And this, of course, gave rise to the politics of national security. And what is, I think, unique here in the region was governments were able to label their Muslim activists who were looking for political autonomy or political rights and labeled them as terrorists. They played on the discomfort of the public to swoop in on legitimate political activities by members of the community. Then we had the SARS, and I think this is where things like quarantine, contact tracing were marginally introduced because it came fast and furious, and affected some key countries in Southeast Asia, just like Singapore and Thailand and Vietnam to some extent. So you can see the early genesis of those kinds of efforts, which is now expanded. And then I think the tsunami is also instructive because it landed a natural blow because it affected Aceh so much that the independence movement, the autonomy movement was wiped out, and the military moved in to clear up operations. So these, crises kind of, reinforce the residue left over each of these crises, kind of reinforce and, form the backbone of why we see democracy, regress. And I want to suggest that for this time, it's severe because this crisis is quite protracted, and it is a crisis within the age of technology. Another thing that is quite common is what we call the crisis playbook. almost all crises, the governments operate in the following way. They enact emergency and temporary laws. They suspend or curtail democratic activities in the name of a crisis. They surveil citizens. They frame opponents, especially those who speak up during the period of crisis and call out mismanagement of crises as national security threats. They extend all these temporary laws, as we have seen during this period, and then they take the so-called authoritarian residue and strengthen it in permanent laws moving forward. The key issue here with the laws and policies that we looked at was simply that they were all continuously extended. There were three tools they used. First was to sort of activate existing emergency laws, and they declared it was an emergency and then used that to extend it on a regular basis. In some countries, they convene national committees, such as in like Vietnam and Laos, that had some power to enact, movement control orders, social distancing, and other, health-related control mechanisms. And then there were sort of laws passed, temporary legislation to deal with the crises. So the point to take away here is this crisis brought into the region a new set of laws and policies for now a very extended period of time, quite unusual. And part of the rights, violations comes from these extra layers of laws. We can see them, played out in the way protests are curbed. Now, they have different impact or effect in different countries in Southeast Asia. In some countries, it basically halted protests. So when we moved with the COVID-19, there were a lot of political issues festering. Like in Malaysia, there was electoral transition issue with the change in government. In Indonesia, there was the omnibus law. In Thailand, there was unhappiness with the dissolution of the Future Forward Party, and young people were, already gathering en masse. So these laws during COVID-19, were also used to try to curtail and curb those ongoing political activities. But there are two features that one needs to be aware. In some countries, they were effective, like in Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, Myanmar. These laws actually managed to quell political activity. Whereas in countries such as, and Cambodia, whereas in countries such as Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines, in spite of having such laws, policies, and decrees, democratic activities still pushed ahead, led by young people, women, civil society actors, which belies the fact that, especially in these three countries, there was a core of active civil society that was still able to operate. And that, I think, is an important feature to take note, and why building and shoring up civil society strength is important. The other dimension is just electoral democracy. We saw that erode. There were three features here. One is the election schedules. What is interesting here, in the case of Singapore and Myanmar, is they kept to the date of the elections, even though opposition parties and certain quarters of the public, they were apprehensive, especially in Singapore, because it called it quite in the mid-year, and when there was still a breakout in the workers' dormitories. the subtext really is, from our analysis, is, they were hoping that this will put the opposition on the back foot, right, with social distancing and, limited opportunities to campaign and so on. Malaysia, to some extent, is a little bit unclear because, the attempt to call elections, and convene parliament has been going back and forth. Indonesia just pressed ahead after an initial delay. So you will see that election schedules were kind of, leveraged off, often, in the hope that this will give the incumbent some benefit, but not necessarily the case. Secondly is parliament shiftings. In Thailand, in Malaysia, you find that, parliament didn't sit on time. There were postponements on some occasions, all of it just to kind of play politics to ensure that they can get away with it. We also had some issues similarly in Indonesia, as they were trying to kind of scuttle or get around the challenge on passing the omnibus law. And finally, political attacks, here in particular against individuals, as in the case of the Philippines and the vice president who has been under attack, and also in Cambodia and Thailand, where political parties were dissolved and political activists were persecuted. In terms of criticism, what we saw here with the new laws, temporary and emergency laws, that it covered fake news or disinformation. Because we went into the crisis with certain countries already having passed specific disinformation or fake news laws, and some having proposals in the pipeline. But with COVID-19, these emergency and temporary laws also had provisions. So as a result, you kind of have a full canvas of laws derived from many quarters, including the use of existing legislation. So you have a full network of legal tools in the region to deal with fake news. And the thing to watch out here is really that often what is, how it's worded in the law, it's vague in terms of what's fake news. It is the state that defines it in most cases, and it doesn't cover government fake news. And these are used primarily, unlike in the US where Trump used it against the traditional fact-based media and called them fake news. Here, it is used by the incumbent as a tool of attack against its political opponents. Around the media, again, governments took issues with specific journalists. Politicians in power took special interest in journalists, in particular, attacked them, or they attacked the media companies, did not renew their license, as it was in the case in the Philippines. But also, the COVID-19 also affected business. So, the media had a double whammy as well. Many media companies, either closed down or had to go digital. And we record some of these incidents and examples in the report. So for journalists, there was issues of job security and also how they worked because, for example, they couldn't go to interview people on site. It's not often you are able to access particular groups of people online, especially if they are, let's say you want to interview somebody behind bars, for example. And as a result, because what you say in the media can be attacked, either as a journalist on the media companies or even over social media, it increased self-censorship. So moving from there, we go into surveillance. Just like the way the governments are able to implement and practice national level lockdowns simultaneously taking place across the region. In terms of surveillance, this has been very, very widespread. So it's not just reading your emails or watching you over CCTV. I think the issue of contact tracing has taken surveillance to a different level. So not only can they pinpoint you in terms of GPS, but they can also check your proximity with others. So they not only know where you go, but they also know who you are with or who's close by. So that's the depth of the technology. And the issue here really is almost all of it is on government service. If government say it's on your phone, we'll still have to ask the secondary question, then where the data on the phone is actually finally anchored and who accesses. So that's one issue. The second issue is governments, without control or oversight, share this information interminister between the different ministries. So this means the level of surveillance is quite intense, and they had a long time to practice it. And because the pandemic is not over, and even with the arrival of the vaccine, contact tracing will still be important because we don't know whether the vaccine works. And we also want to study the behavior of the vaccine and its effectiveness. So therefore, contact tracing will be articulated as necessary. It's already being articulated as necessary as we hear reports of vaccine rollout. So this is, I think, very important, and I think will be the key authoritarian residue that will be left behind. And because women and youth are becoming the new targets, and youth in particular leading the charge, as we can see in Thailand, in the Philippines, and Indonesia, moving forward, the youths will become the most surveilled generation of all time. And that's something I think significant coming out of the COVID-19. And finally, a word on support and donors. I think what we observe, in our conversation with our partners and other colleagues from other groups in civil society and the not-for-profit sectors, the donors fumbled because it was clear to us there weren't many people within the donor entourage who had the historical benefit of viewing many crises and knowing how to respond. So you had new people on the job who really didn't know how to manage partners in previous crises. And if they were very little. Secondly, their immediate reaction was, first of all, to say, okay, if people can't travel and can't meet, we will have to pause the project. In some cases, we were told donors even asked to retract funds that were already transmitted out, and definitely stopped all other, payments that were forthcoming. Then they raised their guidelines, which were not, suited for, responding to this crisis, and also for the quick take-up of technology, which many groups, leaped into as a response on, how to operate during closed borders and social movement controls and social distancing. In fact, many donors are still grappling with how they want to support digitized civil society. They want to support on activity-based. So if you run a webinar, then you may be able to charge for the use of Zoom. They are unable to make out that, it might be cheaper to have Zoom, subscription over the year. After all, if you're doing projects, with a particular partner over the year. To use things like Google Suite, where you use emails and storage, they see it as capital investment, and therefore they are unwilling to support. Now, it varies from donor to donor, but broadly, that's how it is. They would want some feedback on how useful or effective or what your audience learned from your event. And if you use SurveyMonkey, they may be reluctant to pay for it, or they question the subscription. So these are the stories we get. And if you're talking about needing to buy a laptop or a TV screen or an omnidirectional microphone, adjustable camera to do your calls, then it's almost impossible. Moving forward, it's likely, because civil society will innovate. I think many NGOs will try to have some kind of in-house studio if they're able to do so, which requires capital investments of lights, camera, microphone, backdrop, you name it, and a set. So the donors are just not quite there yet. And I think this is why civil society has to be self-reliant moving forward. So I think it's important to understand all of this, and I'm down to my last couple of slides here, the SDGs. The SDGs generally had slowed down, whose target of implementation is 2030. But for our purposes, I think in particular where it has stalled is SDG 16, where we talk about strong institutions, right? So here, without support for civil society, and I've just outlined just a part of some of the challenges civil society have with the existing donors, then you can't build strong institutions unless civil society build it themselves with alternative ways of approaches, and seems that may be necessary. And also we've seen that electoral democracy is also being tempered with, so SDG 16 is quite relevant there. But I think where it really makes impact is 1610, that deals with freedom of expression, access to information, and privacy. You will see that by curbing protests, stifling criticism, increasing surveillance, and attacking the media, SDG 16.10 has regressed substantially. And with these additional laws in place, and it's likely to be extended over a period of time, and we are going to have a strong surveillance residue, unless some efforts are made to restart the SDG process, we will find this would be one of the goals that the UN will struggle to somehow get on track. And finally, I'll just quickly go into the recommendations. Our broad recommendation is really to say support civil society. We call on the UN, we have the details within the report, but basically we say to the UN, include them, talk to your states, partners, and try to mainstream civil society in multilateral discussions. I mean, the UPR includes them, but more can be done. We say the same also to governments, that instead of always, putting civil society on the back foot, include them in the discussion, and also provide resources for them, independently, of course, and come up with an independent mechanism that will disperse this support, best, made up of civil society partners themselves as oversight mechanism, and that should be important. We ask donors to make sure that they have people on board who are experienced in responding to crisis, and look very carefully at the rigidity of the rules. We are not asking for them to abandon accountability and transparency, but certainly in terms of those few items around technology and the need to capital support the establishment of studios or Zoom capacities and so on. And for civil society, well, you have to help yourself. So therefore, innovate, and also look at how you can be self-reliant moving forward. So with that, we call for an action plan. I think there's much to be done in terms of understanding the impact of COVID-19 on democracy and human rights in the region, as well as beyond, of course. And we call for more evidence-based research, developing knowledge tools, running more capacity building activities, advocacy, and of course, strengthening online capacity. And we would like to, call that this is done in partnership. In terms of Asia Center, this report will inform the center's program of activities moving forward in 2021. Following the report, we will engage to put out the findings through the media. We have already had our first op-ed come out today. We've got a couple of more in the fire, and we'll be, writing a couple of more, just so to hot off the report launch. We'll be also putting out content over social media, and we will be taking up speaking engagements, within Thailand and through webinars to kind of make sense of, how we can mitigate the impacts of COVID-19. We've got a couple of events that we want to flag here. First, we have our 5th Benedict Anderson Memorial Lecture on COVID-19 and vaccine nationalism. I think it's a topic that, he would not have thought of, but the center has been holding this almost every year in its memory. And we have an emerging panel there. So book a date, and if you want to be a partner and you want to participate, let us know. And then we are putting together our flagship conference. This is for October in Thailand. So I hope you can come, get your jabs, and in a positive note, hopefully you all can travel. What we are looking for here is partnerships, either as a call partner or as a panel partner, so feel free to reach out. I once again like to stress that this report is a collaboration between Asia Center and the Empowering Fundamental Freedom Defenders in Southeast Asia and East Asia. Is a network of civil society partner. They're better known by the acronym FDA, and you will see their logo, co-branded with our logo on the report. In fact, the report is now ready for download, and we will send the link to you now shortly. With that, I will end my presentation here and hand over the time back to Robin.
Very good. Thank you, James, for presenting the report. So let me now turn to Dr. Rebecca Stratting for her comments. Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to begin by thanking James, Robin, Claude, and the rest of the Asia Centre team for inviting me to the launch. And I would like to congratulate Asia Centre and its partners on compiling such an important and timely analysis. I think from my kind of standpoint, there are 3 really important contributions that this report makes. The first is about the way that it situates COVID within a kind of crisis framework and compares what's happening during the COVID-19 crisis with other crises. I think that's a really useful way of understanding the sort of the second key standout point, which is the authoritarian residue, and how laws are enacted in periods of crises, but they can remain in place long after the crisis has left. And the third real standout point for me when I read the report was the really useful way that it explained what's different between opportunism versus a legitimate public health measure. And I think that's something that is really useful to try and grapple with and to untangle and to particularly hold governments to account. So those are the 3 sort of key points that I really got out of reading the report. But I have to confess, my background is actually international relations. So I would like to focus some brief comments on situating the report in some broader global and geopolitical trends. Much attention has been, of course, paid in the ways in international media and think tank analysis to COVID-19 opportunism, as well as the ways in which COVID-19 is intensifying or accelerating pre-existing trends in global politics. So these are the sort of terms that are coming out: intensifying, accelerating, deepening, trends that are in fact already sort of occurring. And one of those trends is a decline in global democracy and quality of democracy. So for well over a decade now, organisations such as Freedom House have consistently documented a decline in global democracy and individual freedoms. And I think this report demonstrates quite clearly how COVID has enabled an intensification of this pre-existing trend. Presented opportunities for governments in Southeast Asia, as the report says, to tighten their grip on political power and the individuals and communities within their states. So many in my discipline of international relations are concerned about the decline or even the end of the international liberal order, or the international liberal rules-based order, as it is also known. But it is, of course, important to consider what a less liberal or less democratic region looks like in real terms for individuals, for communities, for advocates, and for civil society. And so the report plays a really important role in shedding a light on civil society and the role of civil society in democracy promotion. It reminds us of the human dimensions of these broader trends. I think another important global trend to consider is the geopolitical competition in Asia, most prominently between the United States and China, and what these trends might actually mean for democracy promotion in the context of the shifting balance of power, not just for Southeast Asia, but for regions and for global, more generally across the globe. For example, what might a Biden presidency look like in terms of US engagement with Southeast Asia, and what consequences might this have on pressuring governments to take seriously human rights and civil liberties? Or is the US likely to be preoccupied with its own democracy issues? But I think that there is an important issue to consider here about whether there is this decline in US leadership in the region. And if that's true, if there is this decline in leadership across Asia, is this emboldening autocrats or authoritarians in Southeast Asia to make these sorts of moves and to implement these sort of laws, knowing that it won't get the pressure from other governments that it might have in the past. So the US declaratory policies, for example, have inculcated strategic contestation narratives that pit China and the US in this dyadic competition between, and I quote, free and repressive visions of the future international order. So I think the geopolitical trends are interesting in thinking about thinking about the sort of the future trends in democracy in Southeast Asia and relations between Southeast Asian governments and between other states in the region. Just as a final comment, I would like to note that there are three sort of perennial tensions that emerge in the analysis in this report between national security and human rights, between sovereignty and democracy promotion and global human rights promotion, and between local and global responses in addressing the erosion of individual liberties, democratic quality and civil space. And these are issues that are not limited to Southeast Asia, and even the so-called established democracies have also seen COVID opportunism emerge under the guise of national security. So once again, I think that point that this report makes about the authoritarian residue is really quite significant. And this idea of thinking about what's likely to last after the crisis and how that might help us to distinguish between a legitimate public health response and something that is merely a government trying to consolidate their grip on power. So I might leave my comments there, but once again, I would like to congratulate our partners at the Asia Centre for an excellent and timely report, and it's a real honour to be here to help you launch it today.
Thank you, Rebecca, for your comments. Very interesting comments, especially on the geopolitical dimensions. I too am a fan of international relations, and I take on board very carefully your comments about. Very interesting comments. While you were speaking, a question came in, I think, for Dr. James regarding how are the youth being affected? So maybe James could think about that and perhaps answer that question to the person who asked it. Let me now turn to Dr. Christina Kironska for her comments.
All right, so James and the Asia Center, let me also congratulate you on the report, and let me give you some details on the situation in Myanmar. Many of these instances that I'm going to mention are included also in the report. So in Myanmar, the pandemic has given those in power the opportunity to enact emergency and temporary laws, suspend democratic activities, and stifle political criticism. Public voices in Myanmar are censored under the subjective and vague policies that outlaw the spread of disinformation, and this can be done under the telecommunications law. You can be jailed for 3 years, or under the penal code where you can be jailed for 2 years for defamatory actions. So the state in Myanmar has shut down the internet in 2 states, Rakhine and Kachin, and this way preventing online meetings and also access to information related to both the elections and the pandemic. So in February, there was a student-led protest against this, against the internet being shut down. And it ended with charges being laid against the protest. This is also mentioned in the report of the Asia Center. Then in April, 3 people were charged for COVID-19 street art. You can see the picture on the slide. And then in May, a journalist was jailed for 2 years for reporting a COVID-19 death. So these are only a few of the most outrageous cases. Then also many well-known media outlets had to stop selling newspapers because their journalists were not allowed to travel and also to produce physical copies of the papers. Unsurprisingly, the 2 state-owned newspapers, they have been able to continue printing. So Myanmar held an election in the midst of the pandemic, no easy task. So there were general elections on November 8th. These were the second elections under the quasi-civilian rule, the so-called transition, meaning the transition was a top-down decision that led in 2010 to 2011 to political changes, but not necessarily democracy, as many expected or hoped for. And the military is still holding a very strong position. So besides the pandemic hampering the election process in Myanmar, there's some other systemic shortcomings. I just quickly want to tell you about them. It's the voter lists not being complete, the military personnel in some areas allowed to vote inside military compounds, no internet access, as I mentioned before, and then people in parts of Rakhine, Kachin, Karen, and Shan states not being allowed to vote due to the constituency cancellations. You can see a map of all the areas where voting has been canceled. And then also 1 million Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh and other countries, as well as the Rohingya remaining in Myanmar. It's estimated there's 600,000 of them in Myanmar. All of them not being allowed to vote due to the discriminatory nationality laws and practices. Since Myanmar's first COVID cases in March, there has been a surge in infections with more than 29,000 reported cases and over 600 deaths just 2 weeks before the elections. And currently the number is about 95 or even more thousand cases and 2,000 deaths. So obviously this caused many problems. So the stay-at-home orders have been enforced in several regions and effectively banned many political parties from in-person campaigning. And so campaigning had to move online. This benefited the bigger parties, such as the NLD, with the largest social media space. The opposition, as James has mentioned before, called for a postponement, but it's actually not sure how this would have worked out with the constitution. Because of travel restrictions, international flights were suspended. There was very scant international election monitoring. Only the Carter Center and the Asian Network for Free Elections participated, as opposed to 6 such organizations, including the European Union Election Observation Mission in the last elections in 2015. And we all know that international election observation is quite critical. Myanmar's election process has flaws. It had flaws also in the previous elections, but people accepted the result in part due to the presence of observers. I myself was supposed to go to Myanmar and observe the elections last month, but for obvious reasons that did not work out. Since we're speaking about the elections, let me very briefly tell you about the results. As was expected, the NLD won the elections. What was less expected was that Aung San Suu Kyi would secure an absolute majority of seats in both houses of parliament. Altogether, she got 83% of the elected seats. The NLD had a majority also before, and it did not put that in good effect in the last 5 years. Aung San Suu Kyi herself has downplayed allegations of genocide, including when she represented the government of Myanmar at the ICJ last year in 2019. Moreover, there has been a lack of progress on peace and federalism, and this all should actually have meant a better performance for the ethnic parties. What about the future? The NLD might be operating like a one-party government. This means it's a lost opportunity to power and also a threat to democracy, because for democracy to function, we actually need an opposition. And after the elections, when hundreds of people went to the streets to celebrate the victory of the NLD, many of them have been reported sick afterwards, and also more than 50 poll workers tested positive for COVID. 2 died, so this all is very unfortunate. I'll finish my presentation here, so thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you very much, Christina, for your presentation and your case study of Myanmar, which ties in very nicely with one of the findings of the report regarding the conduct of elections. And so maybe we may return to that as we go along. Let me now turn to Celito Alege for his comments from Celito from CALD. Celito, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Robin. So first and foremost, please allow me to thank the Asia Center and FDIA for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts on this important baseline study. I believe congratulations are also in order because this particular report is the first systematic attempt, to my knowledge, to synthesize around 200 research publications on the impact of COVID-19 on democracy and human rights, particularly in relation to Southeast Asia. Before I continue, please allow me to share some information about the organization which I represent, the Council of Asian Liberals and Democrats, or CALD. So CALD is a network of liberal and democratic political parties and individuals in Asia. It was founded in 1993 in Bangkok, Thailand, with the support of then Thai Prime Minister Chuan Likpai, Thai Foreign Minister and CALD founding chairperson, later ASEAN Secretary General Surin Pitsuwan, and then South Korean opposition leader, later President Kim Dae-jung. Our member parties in Taiwan and Indonesia are two of the 9 CALD full member parties from East, Southeast, and Central Asia. These two are the only ruling parties, and we have 2 more in coalition. The rest are currently in opposition. We also have an observer party in Japan and individual members from Indonesia and Hong Kong. It was no coincidence that our founding coincides with International Human Rights Day. So tomorrow, December 10, we will be celebrating our 27th year anniversary. For this reason, we really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this report launch, as we are aware that this event is also Asia Center's way of commemorating the importance of this landmark adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So coming from a network of political parties and political leaders, I hope that you understand that I will concentrate my comments on the issue stifling political criticism, which is most relevant to CALD. So in the report, the following are, I think, the most important points with regard to the issue. So the report said that fake news legislation, as what was discussed by James, and other pre-pandemic legislation dealing with telecommunication, multimedia, computer crime, defamation, sedition, among others, they have been used to dismiss criticism of the government's mismanagement of COVID-19. Worse, these laws have led to the arbitrary arrests of individuals, particularly women and children, women and youth, for asserting their freedom of expression. I apologize for the typo. Third, these laws and policies were also used to censor and limit media reporting of government's inaction. And finally, these actions coupled with the government's all-encompassing powers as a result of the pandemic resulted in self-censorship among the dissidents. As regards this issue, the report concludes that, and I quote, "It is imperative that these laws and policies utilized under the pretense of preventing panic and chaos not be arbitrarily enacted to further stifle statements directed towards government as COVID-19 subsides." So this ties very nicely with the observation of my other co-reactors as regards authoritarian residue. Moreover, in the recommendation of the report, it states, and I quote, "Laws and policies to address the COVID-19 pandemic that are being and have been implemented must be legal, justified, proportional, and necessary. Once no longer justifiable or relevant, this must be removed. They should not be used as political tools against civil society and also against political opponents, if I may add." So please allow me to share my thoughts on the findings, conclusion, and recommendation of the report with regard to political dissent. So I summarize this into 3 major points. The first point, well, since majority of the countries in Southeast Asia are either authoritarian or semi-authoritarian, it should not come as a surprise that they seized more powers and adopted more draconian measures during the pandemic. As what James said, they have done it in the past. But what is more worrying for me is for countries such as Philippines, Indonesia, and even Timor-Leste, which are supposedly more democratic compared to other countries in the region, also succumb to the temptation to adopt more draconian measures. In the Philippines and Indonesia, for example, part of the explanation could be because of the appointment of retired and active military and police generals instead of healthcare professionals to lead COVID-19 task forces. These generals and security officials, by and large, they look at the pandemic as a peace and order instead of a health issue. This relates to one of the challenges to democracy in the post-COVID-19 world as identified by the Brookings Institution. How do we find the place for expertise in the face of resurgent populism and authoritarianism, which demonize expertise and evidence-based decision-making as elitism? Second point, we should counter the narrative of many Southeast Asian leaders that extraordinary times calls for extraordinary measures. We do not have to discard the ways and means of democracy to effectively address the pandemic. On the contrary, democratic processes and methods can actually be used to contain the health crisis. Look at, for example, the case of Taiwan. Taiwan did not impose a state of emergency nor widespread lockdowns in order to counter the pandemic. Despite Taiwan's proximity to China, it only has 718 cases to date, with 7 deaths. More importantly, it used social innovation, defined as people's participation from all walks of life in order to benefit society as part of its pandemic response. This can be seen, for example, on convenience stores such as 7-Eleven, reporting through open source technology the availability of masks in their stores at the height of the pandemic. Third and last point, as democracy advocates and activists, we must be creative and innovative in our response to attempts to stifle political dissent. The women and youth of Southeast Asia are leading the way, as what James pointed out. For example, we can talk about the Friday Women of Cambodia. These are the women whose husbands have been detained by the government, and they organize weekly peaceful protests in order to fight against the continuing injustices and human rights abuses inflicted upon the members of the opposition party. We also have the case of the so-called Milk Tea Alliance. So it is noteworthy to mention the international solidarity between Hong Kong and Thai dissidents in particular, the youth movements in these countries. And in one interview of a Hong Kong activist that I was able to listen to, he was saying that because of the restrictive political environment in both Hong Kong and Thailand, they become spokespersons of each other's issues, because Hong Kongers cannot be arrested for talking about Thai issues, and Thai dissidents cannot be arrested for talking about Hong Kong issues. So I think these are the 3 points that I just want to point out. And again, thank you so much to the Asia Center for this opportunity, and congratulations again for the report.
Thank you, Lito, for your very interesting comments. And I retain your a key point that democracies can handle the pandemic and handle it well. And we will come back to that maybe in the question and answer period. Let me turn now to Patricia Galdamez for your kind comments. The floor is yours.
I wanted to thank you for inviting me today to this very important, I think, and timely discussion. As you said at the very beginning, tomorrow we celebrate International Human Rights Day, so I think it's very timely, the discussion we're having here today regarding Southeast Asia. And first of all, I would like to congratulate Asia Center and EFDA for this report. This year, I think, has found all of us in uncharted territory as we were confronted with the COVID-19 pandemic, a crisis that I think we can all say that has impacted all aspects of public life, putting democracy at risk and significantly impacting also the UN Sustainable Development Agenda. So this study on COVID-19, I think, provides an important overview on the state of democracy and human rights in the context of the current pandemic. And I have to say, sadly, like it was said before me, it does highlight worrying trends and limitations on fundamental rights and freedoms in the region. But let me just provide a few reflections based on the report regarding laws and policies. I think while the necessity certainly of emergency legislation and restrictive measures for public safety is unquestionable, there still needs to be constantly and systematically monitoring of the effect and commitments related to human rights and fundamental freedoms. And this should be made in a coordinated manner together with civil society and other like-minded organizations. This importance of limitations on measures imposed was mentioned earlier during the year by the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and of Association when presenting key principles of our states to follow in compliance with human rights obligations, noting that any limitations on rights imposed must be in accordance with the principles of legality, necessity, and proportionality. On curbing protest, the restrictions of freedom of association and peaceful assembly put in place to control and limit the spread of COVID-19 have directly affected, I think, the work of civil society. This is not only true in Southeast Asia, but it's also true around the world. However, during this time when physical assemblies and gatherings are restricted, freedom of peaceful assembly and association online should be promoted and protected. This is very important, as civil society is a key partner of governments in responding to crisis, and they do play a vital role in raising awareness, disseminating information, framing inclusive policies, advocating for the protection of fundamental rights and freedoms, and providing much needed support to vulnerable communities during this time. So it's very important, and I cannot overstate this, that we protect and that we ensure this enabling environment for civil society, be it online during this time, during the current crisis, but it is vital for their continued engagement and work in the region. On stifling political criticism and media freedoms, I think this is an area highlighted in the report that's especially troubling. Public access to information is crucial during times of crisis. It's important for governments to provide transparent and timely information regarding the pandemics and measures put in place to address it, and to respect the right of every person to freedom of opinion and of expression. Especially now, during this crisis, also internet access is essential to inform the public, and therefore governments should take steps to ensure its access and avoid shutdowns. Legislation also put in place by countries regarding fake news in an attempt to address misinformation and disinformation is certainly worrying, and it was addressed very well in this report. But I think addressing disinformation and misinformation can be done also by providing reliable and transparent information. And just to highlight, and I think it's important to note, also mentioned in the report, that a free and independent media is key during times of crisis. It contributes to an informed society, and journalists should not be subject to attacks, and press freedom should be respected at all times. On increased digital surveillance, as was also mentioned, applications aimed at preventing and monitoring the spread of COVID-19 raised concerns regarding legal protections to protect personal data. Where and for how long information is stored, the transparency of data use, these are all important questions. And needless to say, government accountability and transparency is needed in this area, and data protection should be prioritized. Regarding the notion of decreased funding for NGOs, I think this is also true not only in Southeast Asia, but probably throughout the world, as we have seen as a result, even more of the COVID pandemic. Funding from donors, as was mentioned, has decreased, certainly during this year. We ourselves here at the Permanent Secretariat have seen this as well. As funding has been very directed to focus on actions and activities that are directly related to fighting the pandemic, which is quite understandable. But as we moved and as we shifted from in-person activities to online activities, this also came with a cost, and we understand this. There's the need to buy the IT equipment and everything that's necessary to now not do in-person meetings, but rather do things remotely, as we're doing today. Actually, I'm sitting right now in a studio that we put in place here within the office to be able to work in this way. So that certainly comes with a cost, and we understand that has been a very high cost for civil society. It has changed certainly the fundamental way we work in this new normal. And that's very likely going to continue even after the pandemic is over. So as we move forward, I certainly think there should be a focus on helping to ensure the financial sustainability of civil society and grassroots organizations. And let me just maybe end by saying that the negative trends imposed by the restrictions in the region as a response to COVID-19 pandemic certainly seem geared to cementing authoritarian tendencies and more backsliding of democratic principles and institutions. So we have to watch this and monitor this very closely. International solidarity and continued cooperation between donors, international and regional, intergovernmental organizations, governments, civil society, and also the private sector is necessary to implement an effective recovery post-pandemic that is also compatible with democratic principles and fundamental rights. I think the recommendations provided in this report point towards this direction on the importance of increased solidarity, cooperation, and collaboration between all stakeholders, including the full and meaningful participation of women and youth that have been also directly affected in all of this. And most importantly, the empowerment of civil society and grassroots organizations, and that protection of the enabling environment for civil society to be able to work in, as I mentioned before. I think although the recent advancements regarding COVID-19 vaccines, which we have seen just yesterday, is still very positive. But there are still some hurdles along the way, such as the distribution of vaccines. So I think the return to normal is still might take some time, and implementation of extraordinary measures, not only in Southeast Asia, but throughout the world, it's probably going to continue throughout next year. So as we move forward, I think one thing to consider would be for democracies in the bigger region of Asia that could play an important role and lead by example, ensuring that in addressing the crisis, all human rights, civil, cultural, economic, political, and social are promoted and respected. And as mentioned in the Community of Democracies 20th anniversary Bucharest statement in June, democratic systems of governance built on respect of human rights, strong institutional capacity, transparency, and trust have the best basis to overcome crisis and build back sustainably. So it will be important for those democracies to lead the way. And hopefully this will happen around this region so we can help out Southeast Asia. As a community of democracies, we adapt, we overcome challenges and uphold democratic practices and institutions. And we do this together with civil society. And this is important so we can make sure that this crisis will not continue to undermine democracies throughout the world. I would just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for your interesting comments. And I take note of your point, basically, of the need for a vibrant civil society. They are part of the solution, the need to have all stakeholders involved. And I think that ties in neatly with the emphasis in the report on SDG 16.10 and the regression that we see there. So thank you all for your various comments and points. We have about, let's say, 15 minutes maximum left for some questions for you to address. And in the interest of time, let me get straight to the questions. We have one here that was addressed to James, but maybe I'll put it both to James and to Rebecca. So the question was, how do you think youth across the region can mobilize to ensure democracy can survive? James and maybe then Rebecca.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. I think part of the answer was also, highlighted by Lito, where we see cross-border alliances happening. We heard the example of, speaking for each other, both from Hong Kong and Thailand. So one way forward is really to, fast track and facilitate what is already happening. I think there's, we need to kind of encourage more cross-border relation among the youth. And I think a lot of it is taking place already because of the COVID environment and pushing people online. So these cross-border connection between youth group may be the way forward and seeing how they can support. But, Southeast Asia contextually is still quite small. So, reaching out, in the broader regional and in particular, even the global context would be very, very meaningful.
Yes, I'm not an expert in this area. I wouldn't mind hearing what Lito has to say about this, actually, but I would just point out that there might be a role to play for education, for higher education in particular, for people in Southeast Asia traveling to other countries to, get to take up higher education in other countries. That might be one way of mobilizing this kind of cross-border relations that James was just talking about, using the sort of the tertiary sector. But maybe Lito could give his perspective on this issue.
Sure, Lito.
Yeah, thank you so much. So with regard to the collaboration between or among the youth, I have to say that the youth's capability to use modern technology, particularly communications, would play a very important role. And we have, for example, examples from within our network wherein the youth was able to facilitate the escape of dissidents from Hong Kong or Cambodia, because they really have this expertise, if we can put it that way, in the use of modern technology. So that's one. Another thing is that, again, drawing from the experience of our network, it appears to us that the youth are less constrained by certain rules and regulations that, for example, govern their mother political parties. So they can be more innovative, they can be more outspoken because they don't hold senior political positions. They can be really strong advocates for their fellow youth members across the region. So like what James pointed out, I think this characteristics of the youth should be harnessed so that we can more or less advance democracy and human rights in the region.
Thank you, Lito. Beck, I threw the question to you as well, because in light of your comments about the global regression in democracy and the new Cold War in this new bipolar structure. And so I wanted to get in there this very important issue of the youth. It seems that youth, not only in Southeast Asia and East Asia, but in the rest of the world, they are kind of keeping the hope alive, if I may quote Jesse Jackson from the US. So that was one important question. Another question relates to the holding of elections during a pandemic. So maybe I could throw that to Christina and to Patricia, and James, if you wish to comment as well. Christina, how about you on this particular issue? Was it wise?
Well, in the case of Myanmar, it would have been very tricky not to hold the elections. And also, it was very uncertain for how much time the elections could have been postponed, maybe until January. After that, there would have been big troubles when it comes to the constitution. So, although the opposition was calling for a postponement, I don't really think it would have been possible.
And Patricia?
Maybe let me just add, I'm not necessarily an expert on elections, but I have to say that we've been following actually what has been happening with the pandemic, of course, and governments addressing the pandemic throughout the year. In the community of democracies by looking really at the principles of the Warsaw Declaration. And principle 1 refers to free and fair elections. So during the pandemic, I think what I can say is that certainly there have been significant challenges in many countries throughout the world, whether moving forward or postponing the pandemic. Either way, I think what's important is that there should be credible and independent electoral authorities behind this that can determine when and how the election should take place to prevent the spread of the virus, to do it in the best possible conditions and safety for everyone. And in addition to this, civil society should have been playing throughout the world, of course, in the different elections, a very important role in monitoring the legitimacy of the results during this time.
Thank you, Patricia. And James, a quick comment on this topic?
Yeah, I would concur that we need an independent electoral body to determine, oversight. The problem in Southeast Asia is, many governments are adverse to independent institutions. And even when they, set them up because of international pressures such as human rights commissions, they always try to, water them down and bring them under government control. So I think that's a generic problem in the region that also requires addressing.
Okay, thank you, James. Another question that came through for all the panelists and is the question of this dichotomy, this tension between human rights and national security. So Becca, you mentioned that, Rebecca, you mentioned that, but I think we're all mentioning it either directly or indirectly, the tension between human rights protection and national security concerns. So given the succession of crises and given the depth and breadth of this crisis, what's your sense about whether this might be a permanent regression? Maybe I'll start with you, Becca.
Yeah,
sorry, Beck.
That's all right. I'll answer to all of the above. I think this is one of the really important questions that the report kind of presents, is this idea of this tension between national security, or even national security / public health, and human rights. And Patricia, in her presentation, also made a comment about the fact that some of these measures that governments have taken are unavoidable. These are laws and policies that governments have had to put in place in order to deal with a public health crisis. And the key question that this report very directly addresses is whether or not those laws and policies that have been put in place will be rolled back. So I know that in where I'm situated at the moment in Victoria, in Australia, there were a lot of conversations around whether or not the lockdown measures would be, and a state of emergency, which was put in place, would continue on after the emergency has passed, and to what extent would governments try to sort of cling to that. But I think one of the issues around dealing with this tension between human rights and security or public health is whether or not civil society and whether or not groups within the countries believe that they will be that these laws will be rolled back. So I think generally where I'm from, there is this idea, there's a belief among the population that once the crisis has passed, we will move beyond the need for restriction. And so I think that's an important factor in thinking about Southeast Asia, is whether or not the population believes that once the crisis is over, things will go back to normal, or whether people and citizens believe that the government will continue to maintain the laws and policies, or at least, maybe roll some of them back, but keep some of them, and the extent to which the crisis changes the laws and policies of the government. And I think that this report, it doesn't, I'm not feeling particularly optimistic reading the report that once we kind of move past the immediate public health crisis, that things will just return to where they were before COVID struck the region. So I think that one of the things that the report does highlight is that there are very real risks of this authoritarian residue. And it's really important, the work that you're doing and the work that civil society organisations are doing is incredibly important for putting a spotlight on that residue and continuing to highlight how these laws have contributed to democratic backsliding and regression across the region.
Thank you, Beck. Anyone else want to add a quick comment? We have maybe just a couple more minutes. If anyone has any quick comments on that topic.
Maybe just to add.
Sure.
Just to add to what Rebecca was just mentioning right now. I agree. I mean, I think I started by saying in my remarks that after reading this report, which is again very timely, it's very sad at the same time, because it does reflect a behavior, as you said it in the report itself, of different crises and what has been happening over 20 years. in the region. And this is just something else on top of crisis after crisis, COVID-19. So regression in democratic practices or fundamental rights and freedoms, it is certainly, it is a problem in this region of the world. And what I also said in my remarks, and I want to highlight once again, is that maybe one way, again, it's not a magic solution by any means, but perhaps, finding those democratic countries in the bigger Asia region, I think will be very important. To have those countries be the flag bearers, be the ones that are leading by example in the region, and acting in strict conformity with their human rights obligations. And we know that any emergency measures implemented to address the pandemic have to be strictly necessary for the protection of public health and lifted as soon as it is practicable, and should certainly not be used as an excuse to silence, target, or harass any members of the population. So I think leading on to these democracies, not in Southeast Asia, sadly, but in the wider region might be is something important that can be done right now, as well as once again supporting and making sure that there is, from as international and or regional organizations that we support civil society in one way or another on the ground, and we ensure that there's this enabling environment for civil society to continue working, especially during this time.
Thank you, Patricia. And in the interest of time, let me just mention a couple questions, but we won't have time to get to them. But as we wrap up, we might think about a question about how to manage the migrant workers in this context, and what lessons dealing with migrants in this context bears for us. And also, there was a question about, I think this was for Christina, what are the prospects for Myanmar? So I wanted to get those questions into you, at least for partial consideration. I'm afraid we'll have to wrap it up there. I would like to maybe turn the floor over to James for some last comments.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. Yeah, just before you wrap up, I think the one remark I will make is, should we focus, on dealing with the pandemic and solving it, as opposed to, paying attention to democracy and human rights violation? Now, this is a key trend of thinking, prevalent in many countries in Southeast Asia. And I just want to point out why this is so. Because Southeast Asians are one of the most propagandized people in the region, because their governments, through the control of mainstream media, have been, speaking to them and socializing them over decades. So it is not surprising that many would think taking a hard stand as a way of methodology dealing with the crisis is more important in paying attention to democracy and human rights. And I think that's the nub of the challenge. What I think the report says is, if we have proper oversight, with civil society playing a key role, and we have independent institutions, then democracy and human rights can necessarily effectively also contribute to mitigating and providing resolution to crises such as the present one in the pandemic. So I think we need to be careful of these, counter strawman arguments. And I think that's the challenge of the narrative of putting democracy and human rights in the forefront in a very, very propagandized region.
Very good. Thank you, James, for those concluding comments on the substance of the report and the discussion. It remains for me just to say thank you to all of you. Thank you to our partners. Thank you to EFDA for collaborating on this report. And please remember, I am reminded that to remind you that there is a link to the survey in the chat box. So please have a look at that and fill it out for our panelists and viewers. And last thing that I will mention again, please remember our COVID-19 and vaccine nationalism seminar, our Benedict Anderson Memorial Roundtable on 20th of January. And also, again, we welcome expressions for partnerships for our COVID-19 in Asia conference next year. So with that, I would like to thank all of you for participating, for your very insightful comments. And I'm sure we will be continuing this conversation in the next year or two. Thank you very much, and take care, be safe wherever you are.